Nelson Moses Lassiter, thank you for joining us again. It's great to be able to talk to you in these crazy, crazy times.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great.
Uh, yeah, it's a really is a crazy time right now, but it's a good crazy in my.
Well, we're glad you're doing well and that you're staying safe. You've been taking part in the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests here in Los Angeles, protesting the death of George Floyd. What can you tell us? When did you start attending the protests? What part of the city were you in?
Well, the first thing I want to say is we're not just protesting the death of George Floyd. We're protesting the death of all of the African Americans that were unjustly killed by police, unjustly treated in this system, and not given due process. And that's what we're protesting against. We're protesting against systemic racism. It's just that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, all of these are the straw that broke the camel's back. Because
Sure.
we're at this tipping point, and we're realizing that the more that we stay silent, the more that we try to go along with the status quo, nothing is going to progress. So we're just at a point where we're tired. We're going to make as much noise as we can until these voices get heard. The squeaky wheel gets the grease.
So now you were at the Santa Monica protests. I know there was some looting going on there, at least on Sunday. Was this something that you witnessed, or?
Yeah, I mean, the important thing is, though, I want to separate the protests from the looting because I think that the media combines the two, but those are two completely separate things that are happening. The
Sure.
protest was very peaceful when I was there. I went with a friend of mine, Max Emerson, and I really appreciated him because he was also using his platform and his voice to highlight a cause. And it was just great to have that level of solidarity because he understood that as a white person that keeping silent about it and maintaining the status quo is going to perpetuate and continue these unjust and unlawful murders of African Americans in the country. So I really appreciate that. And what was happening was that, yeah, we were protesting and it was very peaceful. We were, making our way down various streets. There was so much support. People that were driving by were honking their horns. And, what was interesting, though, was as we started to approach some of the streets that had, a series of retail shops, there were people that were not a part of the protest that were just kind of like waiting for the right opportunity.
Uh,
And once we started to get to, a few intersections, that's when, and I saw this with my own eyes, there were people that were, dressed in all black that were, kind of using the cover of the protest in order to, infiltrate and kind of hide what they were doing. And then next thing windows started getting smashed and they started running in and they actually looted one of the Vans sneaker shops in Santa Monica. And it was interesting because you then see people that were part of the protest start running the opposite way because they didn't want to be associated, and the protest slowly started to scatter before it reformed again. But it was really frustrating. It was really upsetting because we're making all of this peaceful and positive action, and you have these people that want to devalue our cause. And a lot of people are unsure whether or not these infiltrators and these looters were associated with it. But I saw firsthand they had nothing to do with what we were doing. It just sucks that that's what the media is going to identify and associate us with.
sure. Were you at all afraid for your safety, particularly when you saw the looters?
Well, it's interesting. I wasn't afraid of the looters. I was afraid of the police officers because, in their eyes, they're just going to see us all as just one group. And that's why a lot of people started scattering. And I got really frustrated that I actually started yelling at some of the looters. I was like, do you realize that you're devaluing our cause and that you're really making so much noise and agitating things that this is all the media is going to see? They're not going to see the peaceful protests.
Right.
And it was really interesting because they were just, a lot of them weren't even from California. Like, I don't even know where they came from because one of them was like, I'm not even from here. And I'm just like, then what are you doing here?
Yeah.
And that's what really frustrated me. And, as soon as they started ripping down the barricades, you heard the sirens go off and we're just like, we should move to another area because the last thing we want to do is get lumped in with this group. And I understand from the cops' perspective, it's hard for them to really discern who is who, but it really becomes a serious problem because that's when, the violence starts to happen. That's when the protesters then themselves become agitated, and, that's when all this chaos ensues, and that's what you end up seeing being covered on the news and the media.
So what kind of interactions did you have with police? Did you confront any of them one-on-one? Were they being polite and respectful to the protesters?
Well, what's interesting, and I don't want to say that, I'm not here to like badmouth cops or anything. There were definitely some good officers there. As things intensified, I did notice that there were some cops that were focusing on, Black people versus white people, although some of the agitators were white. And that was something that was a bit frustrating. It was also kind of frustrating to the point where I noticed that some people were hesitant to even be at the front of the parade, the protest, because of the fact that, there is this implicit bias that officers have. And they're just like, I want to, I don't want to be the one that's going to get, attacked and beaten. It was interesting. There were parts where once we got to the gate to the Santa Monica Pier that there was somewhat of a standoff. And, it wasn't that we had any intention of like raiding the pier or anything like that, but we really wanted the officers and the National Guard and the security and the SWAT that was there to really understand this is, something that's very important to us. And we want to make sure that you're hearing our message because yes, we're talking to the world, but you specifically as people that are supposed to protect us, you are the ones that we are specifically sending this message to. And, it's crazy because when you think about it, you can have, white men armed to the teeth with rifles and assault weapons going to the state capitol demanding, that the country reopen so they can get a haircut. And you don't have the National Guard and you don't have the SWAT team and you don't have the military coming in. But then you have a bunch of Black people with signs, no weapons, demanding protection. And with that, you then have the SWAT team, you have the National Guard come in. And that says something because it shows that even in peace, there is a bias towards African Americans. And it's like, we are less dangerous with a sign than those white people are with, those assault weapons.
Now, what's interesting is, of course, we have to address the COVID pandemic that's going on in the midst of all of this. We have extremely high unemployment right now. I've seen numbers upwards of 40% unemployment. Do you think there would be this much outcry were it not for so many people already being at home and having to stay in the house? Do you think that is added to the anger?
I think that it's almost like a perfect cocktail. It's hard to say what has added and what hasn't because, when Eric Garner was killed in broad daylight, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, there was no COVID, yet we took to the streets and protested. I think the difference is that, now that there's almost like 40% unemployment in certain areas and, you have people that are suffering and being impacted, it's like the stakes are way too high right now to be complacent and let the status quo just continue. It's less about, the, impact that COVID has had on the economy, and it's more about looking at the distribution numbers and looking at, how African Americans are suffering more because of lack of access to healthcare, and how a large number of African Americans are dying because of COVID and not getting the proper care and treatment. So that's just leading back to a bigger systemic problem. It's not just the police officers and bad policing, and I'm not saying all cops are bad, but they're all very bad cops and they're not held accountable. But the thing is, it's that it's a combination of all of these different factors. So this has kind of created the perfect cocktail to have this level of protest. And I will say that, now that a lot of people are home and not working, they actually have the opportunity to go out there and have that level of visibility. Generally with these protests, when they usually happen, people were working, so they weren't able to come out in these large numbers. And I think the reason that you see these large numbers now is that, people are home and people are, making sure that their voices are being heard. And I don't want to say that COVID is contributing to the large numbers, because I do believe that these people would come if they had the ability to. But at the same time, I can't not say that COVID didn't have anything to do with it.
Sure, sure. In Los Angeles, we've been under curfew for, I guess, 3 nights now. Do you feel like the curfew is necessary to prevent violence or looting, or do you feel like that's just a way of further oppressing the protesters?
That's really interesting. I think that, well, interestingly enough, today the curfew was moved back to 9 p.m. It was having, earlier this week, it was at different, sometimes it was at 4, sometimes it was at 5, and it was at 6. And the reason why the curfew changes is based off of, what's happening with agitators and looters. It's actually for the protection of the protesters. And when things broke out in Santa Monica, the curfew was moved to 4 p.m. And yesterday we had a series of peaceful protests, because I believe that we're getting better organized in stuffing out these infiltrators. I think we're getting better organized in knowing which protests are the right protests to go to. And, now that these things have happened and that the agitation has calmed down, the curfew is moving back to, is being pushed back. And I think, that's a sign that it's not about trying to quell the protests. It's more about our protection and safety, not being lumped in the same group as these agitators and these rioters. And,
Now, I know this week the NAACP has put out a 4-point plan for reforms within the police department. That includes a ban on knee holds, same kind of position that choked George Floyd to death. Clear rules on escalation, at what point police will be allowed to use certain levels of force. Not shielding officer disciplinary action, translates to making records more transparent, and establishing citizen review boards to allow oversight to police officers. Do you feel like those are 4 great steps toward curbing the kind of violence that African Americans are experiencing by police?
Yeah, I think it's a starting point. The biggest issue is the way that police are policed and the way that they're held accountable. And I think that there needs to be significant changes in the justice system, because they feel emboldened to do this because they get protected. What the NAACP is putting forward is a step in the right direction, because it's saying these are actions that can easily be taken in order to make the police department and the local authorities more transparent, and hold accountable when certain holds and certain actions are unlawful that are taken towards African Americans. So I think that that's definitely a step in the right direction. And the biggest thing, it really is police reform. It's the way that the police police. And I think what's really interesting is that the NAACP's the measures they put forward are actually very well aligned with what Joe Biden was actually talking about when he was in Philadelphia. And I think that's great that it's showing that, at least at the liberal presidential level, that there is that alignment with the NAACP.
What is the most important thing you want our readers, our viewers to know about the protests going on right now?
I think the most important thing is to do the research. If you don't understand exactly what's happening and why it's happening, and I'm saying especially if you're a white person, it's your job to figure these things out, because a lot of people are always asking Black people, like, why are you doing this, or what is it that I can do? But in reality, it's like, this is a fight that Black people have been fighting for years, and if you really want to help, don't divert to Black people to have to do all of the heavy lifting. As a white person that has privilege, or may not even be aware of their privilege, there is an inherent power that white people have in this society, and they know how to use that power better than I know how they should use that power. So they have that power, and they should, do the research and understand what systemic racism is, and understand how it's built into the system, and understand how, African Americans are impacted by it, because they're the ones that have the ability to make this change. If Black people had the ability to make this change alone, we would have done it a long time ago.
What are some resources we can turn to at least be kept up to date and to know how we can help?
Yeah, I think the main one really, if you want to do something active and you want to have your visibility and you want to have your voice heard, I would definitely say, you know, focus on any protest that's actually sponsored by Black Lives Matter. I think that's the really that's the most important one. And most cities have their own local chapters, and I think that's a starting point because there are a lot of conflicting information about protests that are going out there. But you also want to protect yourself and make sure that you're not being a part of something that's going to be used as a ruse or a guise so that rioters and agitators can get involved. So definitely make sure that any protest that you're going to is actually coordinated or sponsored by Black Lives Matter. And, those are going to have a lot more organization. They're actually going to be the lawful protests that are allowed by the state because they're going through the proper paperwork and measures to do that. Human Rights Watches is another, there's always resources there. But the truth of the matter is too, it's like, it's up to you. If you actually care, it's up to you to put in the work, like I said before, to do the research and, stop asking other people to give you the shortcuts. Black people don't have access to those shortcuts and we still find a way to make it happen and make it work. So don't use the shortcuts, figure this out, learn, come from a place of understanding, being willing to listen. And once you do go out to the protest, take my approach. Find an individual reason for yourself and why you feel it's important that you are there. So when the protests start to die down, is what is it that you're going to do in your everyday life that is going to, make the world a better place? What is it that you're going to do? Reach out to the Black people that you aren't friends with, or open up your circle. To the gay community especially. It's like you go to these clubs and these bars and it's predominantly white. You don't know what that experience is like to be the only person or one of the very few people there that look like you. So it's very, very important to make that environment a safe space as it's supposed to be and be very, very welcoming. I think it's also very important to realize that as a white gay man, yes, you may consider yourself marginalized because you're gay, but you are still privileged and a part of a majority. And it's very important that you are aware of that power and you use that power for good.